Recently, I've been feeling pretty stuck in a few different areas of my life. And what I noticed after reflecting was this. I wasn't stuck because I wasn't thinking enough. I was stuck because I was actually thinking too much. I kept running scenarios in my mind, playing things out. And all the while, I fell into this trap of thinking that I was actually doing things that were helping me by constantly thinking about them. But now on reflection, I see that actually it was that process that was keeping me stuck, even though it felt like it might be useful at the time. But the past few weeks have gotten much easier because I've started applying a version of the 80-20 rule to how I think about my thoughts when it comes to the present, the future, and the past. So in this video, I'm going to briefly explain the 80-20 rule, then more importantly go into how I used a version of it to help me to get unstuck, and look into the research about why this approach actually works, and explain how you can try using the 80-20 rule in your life too. Let's start with the 80-20 rule. So this is quite a commonly cited idea, and it basically says that a small amount of factors, normally around 20%, are typically responsible for a large amount of the outcome, say 80%. So 20% of things actually influence 80% of the outcome. It's not a law and the numbers aren't meant to be exact. It's really just a way of trying to notice imbalance and then think about how you can use that insight to be more useful. And you start to see a lot of it once you start looking for it. So for example, and typically it's a small number of habits that tend to shape most of how healthy or unhealthy someone feels, for example. But what I like about the 80-20 rule is that it gives you permission to focus on just a few things that actually make the biggest difference and move the needle. And just let the rest take up less space in your mind or in your life or how you're trying to prioritize things. So that's the general idea. Small amount of factors typically influence a large amount of the outcome. But here's how I adapted it when I was feeling stuck with a number of life decisions that I was facing. And I noticed I was spending what felt like a large portion of my time in the future, or at least with the thoughts and feelings that were associated with possible outcomes. So I'm in the middle of some big life decisions at the moment. Buying a house, family planning, living away from elderly parents, and just generally living away from the country that I grew up in, and what that means in the context of all those big life decisions. And I noticed that when I was feeling most stuck and most confused in my mind, it was when my attention was being consumed by questions like, will I regret this later? Am I shutting down options because of what I choose today? What does this all mean for my future, and will it impact the sort of future that I could see? Now, those are all important questions. They definitely deserve some attention. I definitely need to be thinking about them. But what I realized is that I was probably giving them about 80% of my mental capacity, and it was that imbalance that was the problem. Because when we allow our thoughts or our feelings to spend too much time in the future or in the past, that's the thing that I think keeps us stuck. So let's look at the past first. Often we can get in the habit of replaying things that have already happened. So why did I say something to that particular person? Why did I choose that job? What if I'd chosen another way? Why did I stay so long or leave so early? Or we rehearse things that haven't actually happened yet, or start playing through scenarios, future scenarios around decisions that we're trying to make today. And that was definitely the pattern I found myself getting stuck in. Trying to plan out all the different conversations, outcomes, worst cases, best cases, every kind of possible version. But what that actually does is it keeps you stuck in the future or in the past, if that's the situation you're facing. But we can't actually do anything in the future or in the past. The only place we can act, commit, and change direction or enjoy our lives is here in the present. So the idea came to me around this 80-20 principle. What if I tried to ensure that most of my attention, the 80, was being spent in the present? So if I looked at my life and just thought, you know what, 80% of everything that I could be doing with spending my time, what I'm doing with my thoughts and feelings, 80% of that I decided, you know what, I'm just going to focus on the present and be present. And then with that remaining 20%, I'll allow myself to have smaller, deliberate amounts of time that I can actually spend looking forwards or looking backwards. So in the past week, I've been experimenting with this idea. 80% of my time, I'm looking to do what I can to stay in the present, physically and mentally. And when I notice my thoughts drifting into the future or the present, because that just definitely happens during that 80% of the time, I just gently try to catch them. I'm noticing that, hold on, I'm now thinking about being in the future, or I'm being pulled into thoughts around the past. For me, it was mainly really about the future. And then I just bring myself back to the present and say, what can I do right now, whether it's just doing something, physically feeling like I'm back in the room, whatever the case is, just to bring myself back into the present. And then I just started more deliberately setting aside that remaining 20% to then use that for, well, what could I do to plan here, reflect, try to learn, think things through properly. But once that time, or a small bit of time I'd allocated to that, I'd just go back into the present again. I wouldn't let that time seep its way into my enjoyment of the present. Because I think that's where the trap starts to happen, is when we let those thoughts steal from that 80% of the present time, because they're just percolating away in the back. And when they're just lurking there, you can't really be present. And therefore, you're not actually spending 80% in the present. You're letting that 20% start to grow and increase in its influence. And maybe that works for some people, but for me, I just found that's what was causing me all this extra angst and pressure and feelings that I couldn't quite sift through, because I was so lost in the thoughts of the future that I wasn't really focused on what I could do in the present to try and help that, or just enjoy myself in the present and really be engaged with all the cool things that I actually have to get involved with right now. And I think that's where the balance is. It is difficult and it is tricky, because of course the future matters, and looking back and trying to learn from the past, that's an important part of just a general life experience as well. But thinking about the future or reflecting on the past gets to a point where it just stops being useful if you do it too much. That's when it just starts to get in the way of what we can do now, and that 20% just starts to feel like it's actually growing, and the 80% isn't left alone to be in the present, because this just starts to encroach into it and steal more space from it. And I wanted to just disrupt that pattern, because it wasn't working for me. And so for the past couple of weeks, I've just been focused on 80% in the present, 20% in the future or the past. 80, 20. I was feeling less stuck and feeling more comfortable with life and the decisions that I was facing by spending more time in the present. And I went and found some science that actually seems to back this up. So there's a theory called temporal focus theory, which looks at how people distribute their attention across the past, the present, and the future. And the key findings from that is that people who have a dominant present focus, they correlate with increased well-being and just engagement with life. A moderate future focus is definitely helpful for supporting the pursuit of goals, but a really heavy bias towards the past or the future actually predicts anxiety and depression. So in other words, if this 80% is in the future or the past, there are correlations to increased anxiety and depression versus spending 80% of your time in the present, where the research shows there's increased sense of well-being and engagement with life. And the temporal focus theory explicitly warns against taking up extreme positions. So a pure present focus can just lead to impulsivity. And I think we can all make sense of that. If we're only ever living in the present, we're just going to be never planning for the future. We're going to be reacting purely on instincts. And ultimately, that's not going to be a great outcome. A pure future focus tends to increase stress, and a pure past focus tends to increase sense of regret. So behind all of this idea is the sense of balance, and then what is the right mix? There's another theory called Zimbardo's time perspective theory. Now, Philip Zimbardo is, well, let's just say he's more famous for an experiment around Stanford students and prisons, which has definitely been rebuked. So happy to put this out there with a pinch of salt. But the findings behind his time perspective theory do seem to have stood up almost 30 years later. And again, similarly, they show that well-being is highest in people who can enjoy the present, plan for the future, learn from the past, but crucially, switch flexibly between them. He emphasized the importance of balance behind all of this. He said, in an optimally balanced time perspective, the past, present, and future components blend and flexibly engage, depending on a situation's demands and our needs and values. So in summary, too much future focus is linked to anxiety, too much past focus is linked to regret. The healthiest pattern is balance and the ability to move between time zones without getting stuck in any one of them. And I think this idea of the 80-20 idea just gives that balance a practical boundary. Maybe for you, it won't be 80-20. Maybe for you, it's closer to 70-30 or even 90-10. But it's this idea of spending the bulk of your time in the present. And then when you're going into the future and going into the past, it's a conscious decision that you're looking to plan for the future, or you're looking to reflect and figure out what you can learn. And it's time bound. So there's a limit to it. And once you've done that and you feel like it's not being useful anymore, going back into the present and doing things. So I think the way that this is useful is to think of it less as a rule, but more as that outlook towards life. Because we all have to live here in the present moment. Because this is where you notice what's actually happening. You are able to do what's in front of you, or be with the people who you're surrounded by at any one moment. It's in the present that you enjoy the things that are enjoyable, and you pay attention to the small, ordinary moments that make up a very ordinary human life experience. Because you can't tap into gratitude yesterday, and you can't feel what it's like to be brave by putting your thoughts into tomorrow. You can't enjoy a walk or a bit of exercise that you're not currently doing right here in the present. These experiences only exist in the present. And that's where consciously I'm just trying to spend more time. And then some of the time, step out of the present on purpose. So looking back briefly and asking, what can I learn from that? But not getting lost in thoughts of what does it say about me as a person, but just enough reflection to identify anything that could be useful for me to carry forward, and then going back into the present again. A little bit of time, 20% of time in the past, back into the present, where I can actually use what I've learned. Or if we're looking at the future, so occasionally just stepping out of the present to look ahead briefly and ask, well, where am I trying to go? What matters to me? What's the next sensible step? But not how do I try and control every possible outcome and just spending all that time in the future worrying about anything that happens today and how it's going to impact that future. Spending that time wisely, getting some thoughts to those questions, and then going back into the present again. 20% of the time, and back into the 80%. And what this does is it takes into account how our minds work, because our minds always have a habit of drifting towards threats. And what that typically means is that if we leave them unattended, they will keep scanning the past for mistakes, and they want to make this 20% bigger in the past and the future because they can learn from the mistakes, and that's where threats lie. Or they can look to the future because that's where they can hypothesize danger that might be coming. Our minds want to make this as big as possible because the past and the future is where the biggest threats can exist in our minds. So the 80-20 mindset doesn't try to stop that completely. It acknowledges that that's going to happen. It just also acknowledges that most of the time we want to try and bring our minds and thoughts back to the present, because this is where we can actually do something about those worries, or just enjoy the fact that there isn't actually a real threat or danger at the moment, and we can just sink into making the most of what is in front of us at that particular moment. Because the present is the only place that you can influence, and it's the only reality that you can actually experience. So for me, it just makes the most sense to try to spend the bulk of my time there. 80% in the present, 20% thinking about the future or the past, and then going back to the present as much as I can. But I'm curious what you think. Where do you feel you spend most of your attention right now? And how might the 80-20 approach start to influence how you live the next few weeks of your life? I'd love to know in the comments down below.